At Starbound, we like to tell stories the human way, not with artificial slop or AI voices. What's HFY without humanity? So, subscribe if you want to keep it that way. My name is Dan, and let's begin. It was hard to believe how much the galaxy had changed in the past 300 cycles. Zonar and his species, the Blaric, were stunned when their long hibernation ended, scarcely able to comprehend what they saw. They had gone to sleep during a humorous era, when the species of the Galactic Council mocked the newcomers, humanity, for their simplistic languages. Now, they awoke to a galaxy where entire planets spoke Terran. The revelation left the Blaric reeling, united by a simple question. What the hell had happened in the past 300 cycles? This single question was the motivation that sent Zonar and countless other ambassadors to every corner of the galaxy to figure out the truth behind such radical change. And Zonar himself could never have imagined that his own role in the mission, an assignment to an unremarkable and modest destination on a distant agricultural planet, would be the one to unveil the truth behind the galaxy-spanning linguistic phenomenon. Or that it would lead him to meet, in person, the very group responsible for this seemingly impossible change. The AI piloting system guided Zonar's vessel into a smooth landing sequence, the planetary surface of Traw 3 growing larger in the viewport. Zonar hardly paid attention to the amber fields stretching toward distant white mountains, his mind already focused on the investigation ahead. The moment the landing struts engaged, he unbuckled from his seat and crossed to the small mirror mounted near the cabin's exit. His reflection stared back at him. Grey reptilian features, vertical pupils, scales that formed natural patterns along his cheekbones, and the flowing ambassador robes in deep crimson that had been the height of fashion 300 cycles ago when his people entered hibernation. He adjusted the ceremonial clasp on his shoulder, smoothed a wrinkle from the fabric, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction with his appearance before turning toward the already opened hatch where, according to his communication with air traffic control, a diplomatic team from Traw waited to greet the returning Blaric and discuss his species' investigation into the galaxy's dramatic linguistic transformation. The ramp extended before him, and Zonar descended quickly. At the base of the ramp stood three figures, and immediately something struck him as wrong. The Traw people, purple-skinned bipeds with bald heads and distinctive ridges above their ears, stood waiting in what should have been formal attire for a diplomatic greeting. Zonar's memory banks were crystal clear on this point. The Traw had always worn their own version of flowing ceremonial robes, elegant garments with intricate patterns that denoted rank, species, and much more. But these three ambassadors were something entirely different, something that sent a jolt of recognition through Zonar's mind. They wore jeans and t-shirts. Simple blue denim pants and casual short-sleeve shirts in various colors, one purple, one white, and one faded gray. According to every memory Zonar possessed, there was only one species in the entire galaxy that had worn such ridiculously simple, utterly casual clothing for formal occasions. That species was humanity. The sight was so jarring that Zonar found himself frozen at the bottom of the ramp, staring at the three Traw ambassadors who smiled pleasantly at him, seemingly unaware that anything was amiss. "Greetings," Zonar began, working to keep his voice level and diplomatic. "I am Ambassador Zonar of the Blaric. I must ask, if I may be so bold, why are the respected Traw dressed in such informal attire for this meeting?" The three ambassadors exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from pleasant welcome to a genuine confusion. "Dressed like what?" the tallest of the three asked, looking down at his own clothes as if seeing them for the first time. The moment the words left the Traw's mouth, Zanar's translation implant, a small cybernetic device embedded behind his left ear, projected a virtual notification directly into his visual field. The semi-transparent text hovered in his vision. Language setting auto-adjusted from Traw Standard to Terran English, replicating linguistic parameters. Zanar felt his breath catch. This was it. The phenomenon he'd only heard about in the hastily compiled briefings during their species' reawakening. Hearing about entire civilizations abandoning their native tongues was one thing. Witnessing it firsthand, seeing proud Traw ambassadors speaking human language as naturally as breathing, was something else entirely. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to accept this new reality, to push past the shock and focus on his mission. "I apologize for my directness," Zanar said, straightening his robes, "but I must go straight to the point of my visit. Why are all of you using that—" he caught himself, modifying his phrasing, "that human language instead of your own Traw standard? My species, the Blaric, have been in hibernation for 300 cycles due to atmospheric damage from our last conflict. We have awoken to find that the galaxy now speaks Terran languages. I have been sent to investigate this phenomenon and understand how such a dramatic shift could occur in what is, by galactic standards, a remarkably short period of time." The three Traw ambassadors stared at him for a long moment. Zanar watched their expressions carefully, noting how they shifted from surprise to something else, something that looked almost like offense. The silence stretched uncomfortably before the female ambassador on the left, her purple skin slightly darker than her companions, spoke. "Before we answer that," she said, her tone careful, "may I ask if your species has any information about the carbon drift phenomenon?" Zanar blinked. Carbon drift? The term meant absolutely nothing to him. He reviewed hundreds of reports during the reawakening, studied the major political shifts, the new trade routes, the technological advancements, but nowhere in any briefing had he encountered those words. "Carbon drift," he repeated. "I'm afraid I have no context for that term. Is this some kind of scientific phenomenon? A historical event that occurred during our hibernation? Some kind of technical designation I should be aware of?" The three Traw ambassadors looked at each other. For a heartbeat, Zanar thought they might be conferring silently, perhaps through some communication technology he wasn't aware of. Then, to his complete astonishment, all three burst out laughing. Not polite chuckles or diplomatic titters, but genuine, full-throated laughter that echoed across the landing pad. They made no effort whatsoever to be subtle about it, doubling over, the tallest ambassador actually wiping tears from his eyes. Finally, after what felt like an entirety of humiliation, the female ambassador who had asked the question managed to compose herself enough to speak, though her voice still hinted mirth. "Ambassador Zanar," she said, her lips quirking, "carbon drift isn't a scientific term or a historical event. It's the name of a band, a music band, the most famous interspecies musical group in galactic history, actually." Zanar felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath his feet. A band? A music band? 300 cycles of galactic transformation, half the known civilizations adopting an entirely foreign linguistic system, his entire species desperate for answers, and the key to everything was musicians? He stood, frozen, his mind refusing to process the information, until he noticed that the three ambassadors were still watching him, clearly amazed with his reaction. The realization that they were having fun at his expense finally jolted him back to awareness, and anger flared in his chest. "How?" he demanded, his voice sharp, ambassadorial politeness forgotten. How could some musicians possibly cause such dramatic change across the entire galaxy? Civilization doesn't abandon their languages because of music. But the troll ambassadors didn't respond with more mockery, as Zanar had expected. Instead, their expressions shifted to something that looked almost like pity. The male ambassador on the right, the one who hadn't spoken yet, stepped forward, his hand reaching into his pocket. Here, he said gently. Let me show you. He pulled out a slim datapad, his fingers already interacting with the interface. Within moments, he turned the device towards Zanar, and the holographic projection came alive in the space between them. The image that materialized took Zanar's breath away. A massive concert venue stretching before him, easily accommodating what looked like millions of galactic citizens. The crowd was a sea of different species. You could see the tall forms of the Zeragi, the floating gas sacs of the Pneumons, even a cluster of notoriously reclusive cave dwellers. All of them were pressed together, a unified mass of anticipation, their attention fixed on a massive stage. At first, the stage held only 3 performers, no sign of any human among them. The first was a green blob, roughly spherical but constantly shifting, its form surrounded by what looked like dozens of musical instruments. Temporary appendages extended from its gelatinous body, some holding instruments, others manipulating controls. The blob glowed with an inner light that changed colors with whatever sound it was producing. That's Blip, the female ambassador said, her voice taking on a tone of reverence. A formless one from the Andros cluster, arguably the most versatile musician of all time. They can form appendages to play any instrument ever invented, and they have perfect pitch since birth. The second performer was a giant, easily 3 times the size of a typical bipedal species. His skin was covered in intricate tattoos that seemed to move under the concert's rapidly changing lights, and he sat behind a drum kit that looked capable of generating sound waves strong enough to kill. That's thrash, the tall male ambassador chimed in, his voice dropping to an almost worshipful whisper. Zanar from the low-gravity worlds. Rumor has it that the drum set is so powerful that standing within 10 meters of it during a performance can actually cause fatal response in certain species. He doesn't need amplification at all. His strikes are powerful enough to be heard from kilometers. The third performer was a green insectoid, roughly humanoid in shape, but with multiple limbs and what looked like resonating chambers built into its exoskeleton. As Zanar watched, it began producing sounds directly from its body, haunting melodies that seemed to bypass the ear entirely and resonate in the chest cavity. Glix, the third ambassador said simply. A blightor. Their entire species can produce music with their own bodies. No instruments needed. What you're hearing is actually Glix's mating call, modified for artistic purposes. Zanar stared at the display, genuinely stunned by what he was seeing. The scale of the production was staggering. The talent obvious even to his untrained eye. But he was still utterly confused about how this related to language, to the galaxy-wide adoption of Terran tongues. I don't understand, he said, unable to keep the frustration from his voice. This is impressive, certainly, but what about the human? How does... Patience, Ambassador, the female troll said, smiling. Just keep watching. Zanar did, and he was not disappointed. The lights on the stage suddenly cut out, plunging the venue into darkness. The crowd's roar intensified, a sound like planetary engines rumbling to life. Then, from above the stage, something descended. Something that looked exactly like a spacecraft making a landing, complete with what appeared to be real fire erupting from thruster ports. The rocket, because it was clearly styled after the ancient Earth spacecraft design, descended on controlled bursts of flame, surrounded by billowing clouds of smoke that had to be theatrical but looked remarkably real. The rocket touched down on the stage with a theatrical thunk that Xanar could feel even through the recording. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a door on the side of the rocket slid open and two figures emerged through the smoke. The first was human, unmistakably so. A male, relatively young by human standards, wearing simple blue jeans and a black t-shirt that was so casual that it seemed almost defiant. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead and a smile that could only be described as incandescent. The kind of expression that suggested he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he loved. The second figure was a Nular, her skin a brilliant blue. She wore only a revealing black outfit that showcased the natural patterns on her skin, and her long pointed ears were decorated with numerous piercings, 7 on the left, 9 on the right, each one holding what looked like precious stones. Her presence was magnetic, commanding attention in a way that had nothing to do with clothing or appearance, and everything to do with sheer force of personality. "Pete and Alara," the tall male ambassador breathed. "The vocalists." The crowd erupted. The sound was like nothing Xanar had ever heard. Millions of voices from hundreds of different species, all unified in their excitement and adoration. The two vocalists moved to the front of the stage, and then the music started. It was loud, impossibly, almost painfully loud. The drums that Thrash wielded thundered with enough force that Xanar could see the shock waves radiating through the crowd, bodies swaying in rhythm with the percussive assault. Blip's instruments wove a complex melody that seemed to incorporate sounds from many different musical traditions, creating something entirely new. Anglix's body produced harmonies underneath it all, a foundation that made the entire composition feel almost organic, alive. The stage erupted with coordinated light displays that painted the massive venue in cascading waves of color, synchronizing with each beat, each note, each lyrical phrase. Xanar found himself leaning forward unconsciously, his translator implant struggling to keep pace with the rapid-fire lyrics while simultaneously his body responded to rhythms he'd never encountered before. He watched as holographic effects bloomed above the performers, abstract shapes that seemed to visualize the music itself, morphing in ways that transcended any single species' aesthetic preferences. But it was the vocals that captured Xanar's attention completely. Pete's voice was rough, raw, filled with emotion that transcended species or language barriers. And Alara, the Nular female, was singing in perfect harmony with him, her higher voice clearer but no less powerful. And they were both singing in human language. Not Nular, not any of the trade languages, not even Galactic Standard. Human. English specifically, if Xanar's translator was correct. He watched, transfixed as the crowd sang along. Millions of voices from hundreds of species, all forming the words of a human language with varying degrees of success, but absolute enthusiasm. He watched a group of Traw, members of the same species as his hosts, screaming the lyrics with tears streaming down their faces. He watched a Numon, somehow modulating its gas composition to produce approximations of the words. He watched it all, and slowly, terribly, he began to understand. "So this," he whispered, almost to himself, "this is how the human language spread across the galaxy?" The female ambassador paused the recording, the image freezing on Pete and Alara mid-performance, their mouths open, their bodies bent toward the crowd in what looked like supplication or offering. "Yes," she said simply. This is exactly how it happened. Carbon drift formed about 2.5 centuries ago, according to our records. The concept was simple but revolutionary. A band where the only thing the members had in common was the carbon in their bodies. Every member was from a different species, a different world, a different culture. They played music that incorporated elements from all their backgrounds, but they sang primarily in human languages because Pete and Alara were the lead vocalists. They became a galactic phenomenon almost overnight, the tall male continued. And an entire generation of young galactic citizens, people who were teenagers and young adults at the time, learned human languages because it was cool. It was the language of Carbon Drift's lyrics, the language of the songs that spoke to something universal across species lines. And there's more than just one human language, you know, the third ambassador added. Different planets latched onto different human tongues based on which Carbon Drift songs became most popular in their region. Some worlds speak English, like we do here. Others speak Russian, or Portuguese, or Hindi, or any of the dozens of other human linguistic systems. It all depends on which singles top the charts in each galactic region. Zanar stood in silence, his mind working through the implications. Questions formed and answered themselves in rapid succession. How had his species missed this? They had been asleep, hibernating while their world healed, while the galaxy transformed around them. How could music have such power? But he'd just seen it. Millions of beings, unified by rhythm and melody and words, they'd learned from another species. Why had the Council allowed this? But how could they stop it? Culture couldn't be legislated away, especially not when it brought such obvious joy to so many. Slowly, reluctantly, Zanar found himself accepting the truth. His species had missed perhaps the biggest cultural shift in galactic history. They had slept through a revolution, not of politics or war, but of art and language and connection. The thought made his heart ache with a sense of loss he hadn't anticipated. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice quiet, "for showing me this. I suppose I must return home and deliver the unfortunate news that the Blarick have lost so much while we were sleeping." "I regret." He paused, surprised by the emotion in his own voice. "I regret that we will never have the chance to witness Carbon Drift ourselves, to see what you've shown me, to experience it firsthand." He assumed, of course, that this phenomenon had occurred long ago, that Carbon Drift was now a historical artifact, disbanded or dead, as famous musicians from his own culture often were by the time they entered the history books. The three ambassadors stared at him for a moment. Then, to his surprise, they started laughing again, though this time the laughter seemed gentler, almost fond. "Ambassador Zanar," the female said, shaking her head, "the singers are still alive. Carbon Drift stopped performing about a century ago. The band officially disbanded 63 cycles back, but Pete and Alara are still very much with us. They live on this planet, actually. Retired about 40 cycles ago." Zanar's translator implant helpfully highlighted the slight movement in the tall male's expression. A smile. Definitely a smile. "If you'd like," the ambassador continued, "we could introduce you to them. I'm sure they'd be happy to speak with a Blarick ambassador investigating the galactic linguistic shift. They've given interviews to scholars before." The information hit Zanar at once. They were here, on this planet. The most famous musicians in recent galactic history had retired to this modest agricultural world. The coincidence seemed impossible, and yet, as Zanar's mind worked through the logic, his species had been desperate to understand the language phenomenon, desperate enough to send ambassadors to hundreds of worlds. Someone was bound to end up on this particular planet eventually. It just happened to be him. Zanar found his voice caught in his throat. He cleared it, trying to recover his diplomatic composure. I would be honored. When could such a meeting be arranged? 3 hours later, Zanar found himself standing in front of a door set into what looked like a remote farmhouse. The structure was simple, built in a style that mixed human and Troll architectural elements. Stone walls with curved archways, a sloped roof designed to handle the planet's seasonal rains, windows that seemed larger than necessary, letting in vast amounts of amber sunlight. Behind the house, Zanar could see fields stretched toward distant hills, crops he didn't recognize swaying in a gentle breeze. The 3 ambassadors who had brought him here stood at the base of the path leading to the door, giving him space but offering moral support with their presence. Just knock, the female ambassador called. They're expecting you. We'll be back in half an hour to take you back to your ship. Then they were gone, walking back toward their vehicle, leaving Zanar alone with his nervousness and the simple wooden door that separated him from galactic legends. He stood there for a long moment, his hand raised but not yet moving to knock. What did one say to people who had fundamentally altered the course of galactic history? How did one greet individuals whose art had accomplished what centuries of diplomatic efforts could never achieve? The willing adoption of cultural elements across species lines on a galaxy-wide scale. Finally, gathering his courage, Zanar knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if they'd been waiting just on the other side. 2 figures stood in the doorway, both smiling with genuine warmth that seemed to transcend species or language. They were old, so impossibly old that Zanar's first instinct was shock that they were still alive at all. The human, Pete, it had to be Pete, had white hair that had thinned considerably, skin marked with the deep wrinkles that came with a lifetime of expression and laughter, and eyes that still held that spark of something incandescent he'd seen in the concert recording. He wore comfortable clothes, a soft sweater and loose pants. He leaned slightly on a cane that looked both functional and decorative. Alara stood beside him. Her blue skin faded to a softer shade, the pattern that had once glowed now muted with age. Her pointed ears still held the piercings, though fewer than Zanar remembered from the recording. She too looked fragile, her frame thinner than it should be, her movements careful in a way that spoke of joints that no longer worked quite as they should. According to the briefing the ambassador had given him during the drive, both Pete and Alara were only alive because of extensive rejuvenation treatments, high-tech medical interventions that could extend life but couldn't stop aging entirely. They were living on borrowed time, each day a gift from technology rather than nature. "Oh, how wonderful!" Alara exclaimed, her voice still melodic despite its thin, aged quality. "A carbon drift fan! Pete, look, another fan has come to visit." "Alara?" Pete said, his voice patient but tinged with frustration. "We talked about this on the phone an hour ago, remember? He's not a fan. He's the Blaric ambassador, the one investigating the language shift." "Oh." Alara's expression shifted to embarrassment, one hand rising to her forehead. "Oh, I'm so sorry. My memory isn't what it used to be. The doctors say it's normal for someone my age, especially with all the treatments, but it still frustrates me when I forget important things." She brightened suddenly, looking at Zanar with renewed interest. "Would you like to come in for some coffee? I know I'm not supposed to have it anymore, doctor's orders. Something about my stomach not handling the acidity, but I've never been able to kick the addiction to that human beverage. Pete makes the best coffee, you know." Zanar found himself smiling despite his nervousness. "I would be honored," he said. They led him inside, and Zanar followed, his earlier apprehension melting away in the warmth of their welcome. The interior of the house was a museum of galactic history that its occupants seemed entirely unaware they were living in. Photographs covered every available surface. Pete and Alara with various galactic dignitaries, with other famous musicians, with crowds of fans, with their bandmates in moments of obvious camaraderie and joy. They settled in a comfortable living room, Zanar in a chair that adjusted automatically to his reptilian physiology, Pete and Alara on a worn couch that had clearly been their favorite spot for decades. Pete busied himself making coffee in the adjacent kitchen, the smell of the brewing beverage filling the space with a warmth Zanar hadn't expected to find so comforting. "So," Alara said, accepting the cup from Pete despite his obviously disapproving look, "you want to know how it all happened? How a bunch of misfits from different worlds ended up changing the galaxy? If you wouldn't mind sharing," Zanar said carefully. "My species has been away for a long time. We're trying to understand what we missed." And so they told him. For the next half hour, Zanar sat and listened as Pete and Alara recounted their story. They spoke of how Carbon Drift had formed almost by accident. 5 musicians from 5 different worlds who met at a dive bar on a neutral trading station and discovered they could make music together despite having no common language except the trade pidgin most spacers used. They described their first performances, playing for pocket change in small venues on backwater worlds, never imagining that their music would resonate beyond the spacers and traders who happened to hear them. Pete talked about the decision to sing primarily in English, his native tongue, because Alara had learned it to communicate with him and found she loved the way the words felt in her mouth, the way the rhythms worked with the melodies they were creating. Alara laughed as she remembered the early confusion when other species started requesting songs in English, started learning the language so they could sing along. They spoke of their rise to fame, how it had been simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, how they'd never quite believed the scope of what they were creating. They described the moment they realized that entire planets were adopting human languages because of their music, the weight of responsibility that came with that knowledge, and the strange pride they felt that something they'd created for the love of creation had brought so much joy to so many. Zanar learned about the band's dynamics, how Blip's sense of humor had kept them sane during long tours, how Thrasher's quiet wisdom had resolved countless arguments, how Glix's unwavering dedication to the music had inspired them all to keep improving, keep pushing boundaries. He heard about the decision to disband, not from conflict or exhaustion, but from a shared understanding that they had said what they needed to say, that it was time to let the music speak for itself without them. He learned about Pete and Alara's decision to retire together to Traw 3, choosing this quiet agricultural world because it reminded Pete of the Earth countryside he'd grown up in. The conversation drifted to broader topics. Alara's observations on how human languages had evolved as they spread across the galaxy, taking on new words and grammatical structures from the species that adopted them. And Pete's thoughts on the new generation of interspecies bands that had followed in Carbon Drift's wake, how the music had diversified and grown in ways they never could have predicted. Their shared sadness that Blip, Thrash, and Glix had all passed on, that they were the only remaining members of the band that had changed the galaxy forever. Through it all, Zanar sat and absorbed, his translator working overtime to capture not just the words, but the emotions, the pauses, the shared glances between Pete and Alara that spoke of communication deeper than any language. He asked questions, took notes on his datapad, but mostly he just listened, honored to be the recipient of this living history. Finally, after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, Zanar heard the sound of a vehicle approaching outside. The ambassadors returning to collect him, exactly on time as promised. Pete and Alara walked him to the door, Their steps slow but steady, and Zanar found himself reluctant to leave, sensing that this moment, this connection, was something rare and precious. "Thank you," he said, his words feeling inadequate. Lara smiled, that same incandescent expression he'd seen in Pete during the concert recording. "We just made music we loved," she said. "Everything else, that was the galaxy's choice. We're just glad it brought people joy."
"That's right,"
Pete added with a wry smile.
"She said it better than I ever could."
"Thank you," Zanar said again, returning the smile. "Half the galaxy speaks Terran now. My species will have quite a lot of catching up to do." "Oh, then you better get started," Lara said, reaching out to Patty's arm with a touch that felt almost maternal. "The galaxy doesn't wait for anyone, not even for sleepers." Later, as Zanar's ship lifted off from Tor 3, the planet falling away beneath him as he charted a course back to Blarick space, he sat in silence and reviewed the recordings and notes he'd made. Hours of conversation, the story of carbon drift told from the perspective of the two beings who had been at its heart. Tale of how 5 misfits from different worlds had met in a dive bar and changed the galaxy. Zanar thought about his species, the Blarick, waking up to a galaxy that had moved on without them. They had missed so much. Not just the language shift, but the cultural explosion that had driven it, the artistic renaissance that had accompanied it, the gradual breaking down of species barriers that occurred where millions of young beings across hundreds of worlds realized they could share something as fundamental as language and music and joy. They were behind, yes. They had lost time they could never recover. But as Zanar began composing his report, he found himself feeling not despair, but something like cautious optimism. The galaxy had changed, but it had changed in a way that wasn't bad at all. He would return home with a story about music and language and the power of art to transform civilization. He would tell his people about carbon drift, and he would tell them that, yes, the Blarick were behind the current cultural trends of the galaxy. Yes, they had missed something monumental, but the galaxy was still there, still changing, and there was time yet for them to find their place in it, to contribute their own voice to the great ongoing conversation of galactic civilization. As the stars streaked past his viewport and his ship accelerated toward home, Zanar found himself humming one of the melodies he'd heard in that concert recording, the tune embedding itself in his memory even as his translator implant helpfully provided the English lyrics he was approximating.